So I'd like to welcome you all back for our last presentation of the conference, except for the final wrap-up hour. This is day 3, and here we are, having been filled so deeply with so much information and inspiration. It is my pleasure to introduce Gabby Loomis-Amrhein, who is the regenerative land manager and naturalist at Agraria, and I would say is the heart and soul of most of the projects that are going on at Agraria. So much happens under her energy and guidance and wisdom. So Gabby is a longtime resident of Yellow Springs, with both local and regional experience in small-scale farming, sustainable design, and construction. In her free time, she's an avid birdwatcher, writer, and woodworker. Gabby's going to talk about what birds eat, how birds eat, and what we can learn about our agricultural systems from our relationship to these processes. There's going to be a Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please put your questions into the chat box. Welcome, Gabby.
Denny, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, we will get started then. Can everyone see? Let's see here. Just trying to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint here?
Yeah, but you should make it full screen.
There we go.
Presenter view. Perfect.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks again for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here today, although I'll admit there is a part of me that would rather be outside in this unusually warm November weather. So we'll just jump right in here. I've named this presentation a variety of things over its inception. Really, it's just me connecting a lot of disparate or seemingly disparate things I'm interested in: food, birds, agriculture. So a couple of quick definitions here. Interspecies just means across species, right? And when I bring up that term, generally I'm talking about humans and non-human animals, or ecological neighbors, I sometimes call them. And then foodways, we all tend to understand as being how food and culture kind of combine and mix and are inseparable. And I really like applying the idea of foodways to non-human species as well. So this idea has really helped me to understand how to better serve my ecological neighbors in the way that I do farming and that we do farming at Agraria. So here's some geographic context. So Agraria is located just outside of Yellow Springs. If folks can see my mouse here, Agraria is right here, these few fields. And so we're really close to these segmented sections of forest and these parks, Glen Helen right here, John Bryan State Park, and the Little Miami River that runs through this area, along with several other major rivers that lead into the Ohio. Here's a slightly zoomed out view. You can see the more populated area to the left is kind of the edge of the Dayton area, which leads down into the Cincinnati metro area. All of this is really important because it shows where people are, and where people are, we need food, right? Birds tend to find food along waterways. And the reason I'm bringing up these waterways is many of the migratory flyways in the United States are based around the existence of water. Where there's water, there's food, there's sustenance for birds as they're migrating. So this is our kind of larger context for how to do agriculture for people, yes, but also for our non-human neighbors, the birds that come through this area and who live here year round. Another really important thing I'd like to mention about Agraria and the Yellow Springs area generally is the Jacoby Creek watershed, which is rather small. Jacoby Creek flows right through Agraria, and it is one of the main tributaries in this area of the Little Miami River. The Little Miami is a national state and scenic river and drains into the Ohio, which then into the Mississippi. So much of the, in particular, northward migration of migratory birds comes through this area. In the springtime, you can sit in one spot along a creek like Jacoby around here and see easily over 50 species of migratory birds. This is what much of the Midwest looks like. I think we're all pretty familiar with the conventional kind of rotation of corn, soy, and wheat, sometimes several others, barley, oats, that we see in the fields as we drive along the highways, as we drive along the country roads. And much of this has been able to happen because of, in the upper left here, you can see these lines through this field. This is the insertion of drain tile into a field. A lot of the land around us is far too wet for the size of modern farm equipment to run over consistently without getting stuck. And so much of this land has been drained systematically and then planted in monocrops. So this is a part of what was known as the Green Revolution, right? It occurred over several decades. Prominently in the 60s, there were a lot of innovations happening. And this allowed for the widespread use of bigger farm equipment, of larger amounts of chemicals that were more available after World War II. A lot of the factories that were creating kind of machines and chemicals for war were transferred over to agricultural systems work. And this wasn't all bad, right? Like we got a lot of food out of this. These are all staple foods for many people, but the system was focusing so much on the singularity of human food needs and not taking into account larger ecological pictures that we're left with these main annual crops and not very much else, a lot of ecological degradation, which we'll get into a little bit later. So rewinding a little bit, much of this kind of agriculture is born out of an idea that came out of the Enlightenment period in Europe, that humans are separate from nature, right? And this idea really allowed for European settlers and colonizers in particular to justify not only the destruction of ecological communities as the United States was settled as it is, but it also allowed for, I would say, a non-examination of the food systems that already existed here that were propagated by native peoples for a very, very long time. So there were already really sustainable, even regenerative food systems that existed here and that were replaced by these kinds of systems. So I think much of regenerative agriculture, as we're getting into this discussion, relies on reworking the idea that humans are central in a process or should be central in a process of agriculture, right? We're one player, and yes, we have a really big footprint, but that doesn't mean that we need to stomp as hard as we can. So I'm gonna back up for a little bit. I think many of these kinds of discussions bring in a lot of science, which is very valid and very important, and bring in a lot of evidence that is based in kind of human observation for human agricultural needs. But I think when we're thinking about what birds eat, we need to look through their eyes, right? And so when we do that, the easiest thing to do is just to step outside and see what's around us. And so these pictures, while not from Agraria, are all species that are either on the property here, they were here, they weren't planted, or they're like in our neighbors' yards. So these are the kinds of foods that birds might see and find enticing. So just going to scroll through here. Many of these foods are interesting in that they are also edible for humans, right? We're not the only species that really likes pecans. We're not the only species that really likes elderberries. If anyone's had elderberry syrup or elderberry wine, lots of birds love these plants. Nut trees in particular are also indispensable in this ecosystem and these ecosystems around us. And in fact, birds are some of the most important players when it comes to the propagation of these nut trees. We'll talk more on that later. Some of these we're probably more familiar with than others, right? Like the raspberries here. Maybe we grew up eating these as kids, whether or not they were cultivated or you just find them in the woods. Some of them are a little less familiar. Some are not edible to humans, or they're maybe not very yummy for us. And some of these plants as well are not native. We'll touch on the idea of what it means to be native in just a little bit here. The plant on the left is a white mulberry, and I hear simultaneous joy and frustration from many people in agriculture when they talk about mulberries, right? A lot of us have this indelible memory of eating mulberries off the tree as a kid, maybe so many that it makes us a little bit sick, but they're just so yummy. It also, in particular, is not a native mulberry and tends to, quote unquote, take over spaces of land. It's an early successional tree that does really well in disturbed soils. You'll notice I'm trying to withhold judgment in the way that I'm talking about this, and I'll get more into that. So the plant on the right in particular here, the one with the smaller clusters of berries, often grouped in four, is Lonicera honeysuckle species. Many of us in the Midwest are very familiar with it. One of its primary introduction points into the United States was in Cincinnati. And most people think of it as a pest, as a plant that only takes over, doesn't provide very much economically for humans, ecologically degrades sites, conservation sites in particular, and it really thrives on the edges of forests and in disturbed areas again. So a lot of these berries have a very, very long history with birds, right? If you are a bird, it's your first year alive and you're learning how to eat for yourself. You're watching other birds of your kind who are exhibiting a behavior, and you see like, oh, they're all eating this thing. You know, I'm not being fed anymore. I'm gonna eat this. I'm gonna try it out. It looks safe. They're not dying, right? And I think that's how many species probably learn. It's how humans learn to some degree, right? We do have language. Birds also have language, though it looks very different. There's a funny story with the plant on the right hand side here, this Kusa dogwood. I was on a trip in New York City and a friend saw this in a tree, didn't know what it was, and just pulled it out of the tree and ate it. And I got so scared, and we spent the next like 10 minutes Googling it because it's a poisonous plant. Do we need to rush you to the hospital? And it turns out that it is totally edible for humans to eat. He was just doing something rather unwise in the moment. But I think it also speaks to how plants are trying to communicate with other organisms. A lot of the berries that we see are very bright and colorful. They're really attractive. They're really interesting. Even if not for a food, you're like, oh, wow, what is this like weird spiky red thing in the tree? And I don't think that's by mistake at all. I think much of what we're looking at when we talk about foodways and thinking about agriculture differently is the constant evolution of everything trying to communicate with each other. It's not just humans trying to find solutions to agricultural problems. It's not just birds eating what they have in the past. And it's not just plants existing as they always have. We're all always, it's this dynamic push and pull that I find really interesting, sometimes frustrating, but. So y'all are probably also familiar with both of these plants. The one on the right in particular is poison ivy, right? 3 leaves. and the berries are white, and it is a native plant. Most folks find it to be not a pest so much, but kind of a nuisance in the garden. Um, this plant alone, poison ivy, feeds upwards of 60 species of native birds, particularly in the winter. The berries are very fatty, which is a really important thing to have in winter. So while it's something that humans typically don't want around because of our reactions to it, it's really important to consider why we're taking something out and the reactions that other species might have to its absence. Just two more fun examples. And I know I'm showing a lot of different plants here. On the left, we have grapes, Vitis species, which are really popular for both birds and humans. They're a really, really heavily cultivated human food crop, but birds also love them as well. It's really, really wonderful as a candidate for what Indigenous Landscapes was talking about earlier, which is native plant agriculture. Something that is fairly easy to cultivate, something that is native, something that also other animals eat, which is really my focus in talking about this today. And then the plant on the right here that we have is an Elaeagnus species, an autumn olive. Some folks are probably familiar with this. It looks quite a bit like honeysuckle. So this plant is actually one of my favorite berries. It's not one that is currently cultivated for human consumption, though it was introduced for agricultural purposes in many areas. There are studies ongoing, I believe in Maryland, to see about the viability of this plant as a food crop specifically. It's a very interesting plant. And then I mentioned elderberries early on. Elderberries on the left here. It's a wonderful medicinal plant. It's not something that humans want to eat straight off the vine. They do need to be processed to some degree. Elderberry wine, elderberry cordial, all very tasty. And then the plant on the right here, there's this term in forestry and in generally in land management that we hear. It's called scrap wood or scrap trees, scrap plants. These things are usually not defined by their indigeneity or their invasiveness or where their origin, so to speak. They're more often defined by their growing habits and by the aesthetics of their nature, how they appeal to humans or don't. So hackberry are often considered a scrap tree by humans, at least in North America. And I think part of the reasons for that are they often get these galls on the leaves, which you can kind of see here. The leaves are a little bit rough. The berries are somewhat hard, the pits are large, and the wood doesn't make great firewood at all. It's very soft, it's fairly brittle. The bark is kind of corky, so it doesn't make great lumber. So from a conventional agricultural or forestry standpoint, it doesn't seem to pose all that much use, right? But part of that problem is that we're thinking of its uses to us solely. The berries are actually incredibly nutritious. They're one of the highest per ounce antioxidant finds that you can find in the woods. The actual outer corky bark is a substitute for cork. So if you're looking for cork for any kind of production purpose, it can be used in that way. It's also a great host tree if you're planting mushroom or if you're propagating mushrooms. And the berries are actually edible for humans. They're also known as tea berries or sugar berries, and they're really, really tasty. They taste quite a bit like very sweet black tea, or if you've ever had like a fruit leather, it tastes quite like that. The kernels, while very hard, you have to chew them carefully, are also very fatty and they taste amazing. One of our naturalists on site here actually has made hackberry nut milk with them, I believe, to great success. So invasion ecology is, to many people, a fairly new idea, a decade or two old maybe, but its origins go back quite a bit further, really around kind of the two world wars. Folks in the biology and ecology communities started thinking about the way that with globalization in particular, organisms that are not humans were interacting with each other, particularly to the detriment of each other, right? So one species would be introduced or would show up somewhere, and then that ecosystem might become destabilized. This was more or less a Western idea at first, though it spread fairly quickly. And I'm particularly interested in the linguistics of invasion ecology. I think it's a really legitimate science. I think it's a really important one, but I think the way that we talk about what we call invasive species can be problematic. So invasive, the definition you can see right here, tending to spread, especially in a quick or aggressive manner. Just within that definition, we see the word aggressive. And to say that a plant has aggression is peculiar to me because I think that implies some sort of intention as well as invasion, right? So this goes on to use other definitions here. We're probably pretty familiar with this one right now of a pathogenic microorganism or disease disseminating from a localized area throughout the body, involving entry into the body by incision, insertion of an instrument, relating to or characterized by military aggression, tending to infringe. So all of these definitions contain words that imply an intentionality that is hostile, right? Military aggression, infringement, insertion of an instrument, entry into the living body to disseminate. We don't know one way or another what these plants' intentions are, right? Yes, they may have these intentions, but we can't communicate with them in that way. And so I like to use the term that I have heard mostly in the context of the permacultural community, which is OOPS. It's an acronym for out of place species, or OOPPS, out of place plant species. So OOPS is a way to talk about these plants, these organisms, without blaming them, so to speak, with the language that we use. Oops to me is a way to acknowledge the human role, the global role, the colonial role in particular, of the way that these plants have moved around, and the way that they've kind of been disseminated around the globe rather than disseminating themselves. Though that does happen, there are many other players. And OOPS also is a very funny acronym in that it talks about the fact that, it's a mistake, it happened, but rather than pretend it didn't or go back on it, let's see what we can do moving forward. Which, to be clear, is not to say let's not involve them in some sort of management practice. So regeneration, I hope that by the end of this conference, most people have a sense of what regeneration is. Breaking it down to the prefix and the root word here, to regenerate essentially means to generate again, and to generate means to create. And in the context of agriculture, that means food primarily, right? So there are more complicated pieces of this. These three words often get confused with each other. There's sustainable, restorative, and regenerative, and not only confused, but they're often used interchangeably. I often have to catch myself when I accidentally use these interchangeably, but they mean quite different things. And you'll find lots of different definitions for them for sure, but my understanding and use of the word regenerative is more or less a combination of sustainable and restorative, right? So sustainable means to sustain a current thing, a current system in this case. We know that our current system of agriculture, of human agriculture, in and of itself is not sustainable. And so to sustain it would be to continue degradation, right? The idea of restorative is to bring something back to the way that it was, which, while this has its wonderful intentions, that's not always possible. It's an admirable goal, but it doesn't acknowledge history, it doesn't acknowledge irreparable damages, and it can lead to the erasure sometimes of these stories. So regenerative to me means bringing agriculture to a place where it can be restorative for itself, a self-restorative system, meaning the combination of something that is restorative and sustainable, right? So the goal to me of regenerative agriculture is creating an agricultural system that doesn't require the constant kind of tug of humans pulling in a direction that feels insurmountable. It begs us to ask for help from other organisms. It requires us to have humility about what we're doing. There are many different histories and ways of knowing about agriculture, but we also have our limits. And I think involving other organisms in the process, involving the earth in that process, is one of the ways that we can strive towards regenerative agriculture. And that's another important definition of it for me, is that it is a process. It's not a goal that we work towards and suddenly achieve and then we're done. It's a relationship. So again, just going back to this idea of restoration, so much of restoration agriculture, while well-intentioned, hinges to some degree on the pristine myth, which was one of the kind of original faults of colonial settlement of the United States by white Europeans, which was that there wasn't already this massive, complicated food system in place that had been tended by native folks here for a very long time. So restoration agriculture hinges to some degree on the pristine myth. And you'll see I'm really interested in language here. Some of it is semantics, but some of it I think allows us to go further and go deeper with the way that we're thinking about regenerative agriculture. So this is going to be a sound recording. And I may have to exit out of full screen here to play it, but we'll just have to see. That gives away who it is. And we'll do one more call here. So those of us who have lived rurally, particularly in the fall, or who do live rurally, are probably fairly familiar with that sound. Obviously, this is the common grackle, which was given away with a link. So the question then is what they're doing, why this happens, right? We've all heard this noise, these birds gathering in really large numbers. So the question is, what are they doing? And this is a term, sky rats, that I've heard a lot of people, particularly older farmers, apply to these three species of birds, a couple others. So the grackle is the bird on the left here. The red-winged blackbird is the bird center, and then the European starling is the bird on the right. They all have something in common in that in the fall, they gather in very, very large flocks into the winter and very early spring. And the way that they feed is in these massive numbers. And they find each other by gathering in these massive numbers and then find food by gathering in these massive numbers. Sky rats is obviously a somewhat derogatory term because in agriculture, rats are not seen as something that you often want around. And the reason for this is they eat a lot of food, they eat a lot of seed, they eat a lot of berries, and particularly in conservation as well as agriculture, they disseminate a lot of seeds in their feces and their poop. And so these birds, when they're eating agricultural crops in very large flocks, that can be a detriment to farmers, right? If they're also eating species, plant species that are deemed as invasive or out of place, that can pose issues for conservation. It can also pose issues for farmers with the idea of encroachment. And encroachment is when it's more complicated than this, but it's when fields become smaller because forests or wooded areas start encroaching on farm fields and minimizing farmable land. So that's why they have this negative connotation around them, is because they disseminate seed, because they eat a lot of seed, and their feeding styles necessitate, in the fall at least, that they are in large numbers. So we've probably all seen signs like this, and probably all eaten at restaurants like this, whether or not some of us want to admit that more than others, right? It's not the kindest thing to shame someone for going to a McDonald's or a Chick-fil-A, right? Say you've been driving for 2, 3, 900 miles, and there's no food around except for this. This is all you can see, right? You're probably going to stop at a McDonald's. And even if you don't eat meat or you don't like the food, you're going to grab a salad, maybe grab a coffee to keep going. The point is you're going to go there. There's not much else that you can see. The way that these birds, the mixed flocks of blackbirds, often feed is this same strategy, right? They're migrating, albeit not as far as other migratory birds, and they're going to stop at the nearest place they can find that has the brightest lights. And for them, that is a translation of plants, right? Honeysuckle grows, for example, in massive numbers, has tons of berries, can disseminate literally millions of seeds within an acre if you have a high density of honeysuckle. And so that seems like a great place to stop. If you've got 10,000 friends in your flock, that is going to be the most food the closest by, because it is everywhere. It's like the McDonald's arches. You see it every highway exit, just about. We're not going to blame them for doing this, right? They're just trying to get food. But this to me is also kind of an apt metaphor, because honeysuckle and many of these other plants that are recent ecological introductions are not synthesized well with these birds' dietary systems. Honeysuckle in particular has been shown to be somewhat of a diuretic for birds. So not only does it have fewer nutrients, but it causes these nutrients to pass through the body faster, not be taken up into bird systems, to the point where with some species, they actually lose nutrients because of this feeding process. So this idea of seed rain is just really a glorified way of saying pooping, in this context at least. So seed rain, you can see the definition here, refers essentially to seeds falling from a plant. More broadly, it's about the dissemination of seeds from a plant, whether it's wind dispersal, water dispersal, animal vectors, right? So what's happening when these birds eat these plants and the seeds pass through digestive tracts, and then they go and perch somewhere, or they're on the wing and they poop? This is seed rain. And it's the way that honeysuckle has evolved, honestly, in a really intelligent way to spread quickly. So this link that I have here is to a site called eBird. It's one of the largest databases of bird information about native birds in the United States. It's one of the largest labs of ornithology in the world through Cornell. And this site is essentially a large citizen science project where folks can submit their bird sightings, and you can keep track of like a life list. It's really interesting. I'm always going to talk up eBird. The point being, though, what we're looking at here are bar charts of the birds of Greene County, which is where Agraria is located, Greene County, Ohio. And so you can see the prevalence over time of birds in a certain area. Take the blue-winged teal, which is a species of migratory duck. You can see it's here in March and April, and then August and September primarily. The reason I'm showing you this is you can look at when each species of bird is around in any given area using this site, and several others, though eBird is really well populated with data. And you can find out when these species are going to be most prevalent in a certain area. So you take the red-winged blackbird, for example, which is one that we talked about, you can see that by the time the end of November rolls around, they're pretty much done. But there's kind of a boom here, end of September through the month of October. And what that is this migratory congregation. The reason that there are a lot more reports from humans during this time of the red-winged blackbird is because these congregations are very gregarious. They're kind of hard to miss. So this is a really interesting data and can help inform agricultural processes when you're thinking about the way that this affects what plantings you're doing, what kind of conservation efforts you're leading, whether or not it's out of place plant removal, and so on, what time of year is best to do these kinds of things. You can think about when the plant goes to fruit, whether or not, for example, honeysuckle, you want to cut that plant before these flocks arrive. This is actually a picture of a what's called a guild in permaculture. And that's not actually super relevant, but I thought it was a really nice illustration of what seed rain can look like in the wild, so to speak. Everywhere is wild, but this is a great example of what it can look like from an aerial shot from a bird. So the central tree here, number one, the oak, is going to be the largest tree in this scenario, right? It's probably 75, 100 feet tall. And you're a bird and you just ate a couple miles back, right down the road. Been flying for a bit and you need to use the rest, you need to rest for a bit. And so you perch in this oak tree, you do your business and you move on. There were probably seeds in that poop and they're going to end up on the ground underneath this oak tree. So numbers 4 and 6, maybe these herbaceous and underground plants, though horseradish and wild ginger and fennel are poor examples of what maybe these birds might be eating in particular. Say pokeweed or honeysuckle might be the plants that then come up underneath the oak tree, which then provide more habitat, more areas for the birds to perch, and so on and so forth. So starting from this single vector, this oak tree, you get this kind of spreading effect. And it's how many secondary succession forests are brought about in agricultural settings in particular. So here's an example that I grabbed from a textbook. Secondary succession often, it says here, takes place following a major disturbance such as fire or flood. Farmland, abandoned farmland, it says here in particular, can also undergo secondary succession. Now, I would say that with the caveat that any farmland, whether or not it's abandoned, can easily and quickly undergo secondary succession. And that farmland itself in the conventional sense is itself a major disturbance, right? So the necessity, the ecological necessity of secondary succession happens in large part because of conventional agriculture. So when farmers are out in their fields and frustrated because of the need to mend fence lines and tend to fence lines and cut trees out and cut bushes out and mow things down and brush hog, this is all just an ecological reaction to the fact that this kind of farming is not sustainable and that this kind of farming is not restorative and that it's not regenerative in any of these things, right? And that the land is just trying to prevent itself from becoming totally decimated. A lot of problems can happen when land is just put into continual monoculture rotation year in, year out. So if we're looking at this chart here, what we see is that, typically we're reading it left to right. There's this major cataclysmic event, which is the fire in this photo. And as we go on, lichens, grasses and perennials, then shrubs, then trees end up taking over. It's a process that usually takes minimum 20 to 50 years, usually more like several hundred when you're talking about a forest regenerating a site. However, if you strictly look at the pictures here, this is also what the idea of encroachment looks like when birds come through. And these seed rain vectors, right? So the largest trees in the photo on the right-hand side, if birds perch in those and then they're pooping and that is turning into these smaller trees and then they're perching on the smaller trees and so on and so forth, this forest is going to spread. And at first it's going to look like small annuals and grasses and perennials, but then eventually will turn into shrubs and so on. And so it's all part of this ecological cycle that has a memory, right? The land itself has a memory of what has been here. There are seed banks that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, actually, in some places around us, that some of which are still viable. Decades is more accurate for most things in terms of viability, but these lands have a memory as to what has come before, and birds are a part of that system. So this idea of encroachment I talked about earlier, one of the most important things off the bat to remember is that it is a two-way street, at least. Many farmers, when they talk of encroachment, many agriculturalists are speaking about the idea of unwanted plants coming into a farm field, right? So in the top picture here, we have a great example of honeysuckle, likely seed rain, so birds perching in the branches of these trees in this tree line. Great place to have a snack, great place to go to the bathroom, then fly on. But if we look at the bottom left here, this is actually, in my mind, reverse agricultural encroachment of the kind we normally talk about, where it's really easy for humans to want to maximize their food production footprint, whether or not that's for food security reasons, whether or not it's for maximizing a return on land, a profit. So this row line, this fence line that you see, has been overtaken by this human planting of corn by at least 6 feet or so, close to the road, into the kind of the right of way of the road. I wouldn't personally take issue with that, but my point here is to illustrate that encroachment isn't bad, it's not good. It's just a process by which something spreads. So we could spend a lot of time talking about all of the problems that are caused by conventional agriculture. These are just a few that I've listed. It's obviously a non-exhaustive list. Habitat loss, population decline, biodiversity loss, topsoil. We're familiar with all of these things. I think it's why many of us are here at the conference today. But what I want to talk about is jumping right into solutions. So dietary crossovers. A lot of these plants that I mentioned early on are plants that, like I said, humans can eat. So cultivation and edibility are two very different camps. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. For example, hackberry trees, while they are really nutritious, the berries are really nutritious, they're not necessarily going to be the best texture for a lot of people to eat, and they're pretty difficult to harvest. They are canopy trees. They grow pretty tall. Honeysuckle's not edible as a berry, nor would we want to eat it. It's not very nutritious. So the reason I'm bringing up these examples is what we should, and what I do, I think, strive to do in thinking about agriculture is who can eat what and how does it benefit them the most. So elderberry is an example that I love. It's a medicinal plant. It's wonderful nutritionally for birds. So I plant it in almost all settings where elderberries can thrive. It's fairly easy to cultivate, and it's useful for conservation. It's also useful for agriculture, right? So people can eat these berries. It's great for habitat. Birds can eat these berries. So solutions, kind of just changing your mindset about invasiveness, this idea of invasiveness, right? Which is not to say don't think of something as potentially posing an ecological issue, but the way that we talk about things in terms of their intentionality, in terms of their belonging, can just replicate these issues that we're trying to deal with. So equilibrium is an often misused word that can mean to hold still, which I don't think is what ecology does at all. It's this constant dynamic movement, but there can be destabilized equilibrium, and there can be kind of a more systemic equilibrium. And then long-term planning, all of this is wrapped up into the idea of having a really long-term plan for the land that you're stewarding or managing. or have a relationship with, right? Like I could go outside right now with a chainsaw and cut down some honeysuckle. But what does that mean? It means that I'm taking away habitat. It means that I'm taking away a food source. And I'm not replacing it with anything. So one of the goals here then is to immediately replace whatever you're removing at least once over in terms of removing out of place species. Optimizing vector management for interspecies agriculture is just a fancy way of saying thinking about the plants that are not nutritious for you, or not nutritious for birds, or not nutritious for your ecological community, maybe are shading out some other plants that are a little more rare or not doing as well, and managing those. That is kind of a negative space of optimizing vector management, which is to say the removal of plants, but thinking about a positive space around it too is really important, which is to say you need to think about inputs as often, if not more often, than you're thinking about what you're extracting, what you're cutting down, what you're taking out of the land. So not just how do I remove this thing in order to better suit my ecological community, but what does my ecological community need that can not only fill those needs, but take the place of this thing I'm removing. So mixed frugivore flocks and regenerative agroforestry is a specific example that we do here at Agraria. We know by doing kind of phenological bookkeeping, so to speak, which is just to say writing down when we notice when birds come through, when mammals are doing what they're doing, just writing down everything that we see, keeping an almanac of sorts, using that information to plan our plantings. So we do a lot of agroforestry kinds of plantings and planning of plantings at Agraria. And we plan for the long-term health of the bird communities that come through here, as well as the intrigue of agroforestry and the potential of native agroforestry for humans as a regenerative food source, and mixing those two things together. Native birds and nut tree agriculture. Folks tend to have not a poor perspective of blue jays, but one that they're kind of like a jokester. They're maybe kind of mean, or a prankster, so to speak. They bully other birds at the feeder. They're one of the main kind of individuals around here, one of the main species that propagates oak trees, more so than people, more so than most other critters in the forest. And they have a higher success rate of propagating white oaks in particular than humans do. They're better at determining the potential success of an acorn statistically than humans are. And the reason for that is blue jays really like eating weevils that can get into acorns. And they can tell when a weevil has infested particular nuts. And so they'll crack open these nuts and they'll eat them. And then they'll go and plant the acorns that are still good to eat up to 2 miles away. And so these acorns, so what they're doing there is they're selecting for acorns that are more resistant to this weevil. They're getting the food themselves, the weevil that they want to eat. And then they are also helping to spread this kind of climax species of the ecosystem around here, this white oak tree, which is the largest host around in terms of hosting caterpillars, mammals, and so on. I already talked about this a little bit, mitigative habitat and understory clearing, which is just to say when you cut down a plant, you don't necessarily want to just leave it on the ground without things. So that's kind of a chop and drop model, is to just cut a plant, leave it there, you don't do anything about it. That can be good in some circumstances, but if you're not immediately replacing something with the same size in order to create habitat for this ecosystem that you're working in, you're taking away habitat, right, by cutting it down. So thinking about piling brush up in smaller piles is incredibly important when managing the understory in a forest system. This creates habitat while your smaller plantings, which are more reasonable to tend and to plant in the first place, are coming up and growing up. Rotational coppicing. So some of us are probably familiar with rotational grazing, right? Which is when you have animals in an agricultural system, you rotate them from paddock to paddock or field to field or forest to forest as it may be. And that way they don't ever graze down a system entirely and killing grass. It mitigates water pollution, water runoff into streams and such. So rotational harvesting of trees, tree coppicing, is a way to address timber needs on the farm. And it provides this interspecies habitat, thinking about birds in particular, as we're cutting down these understory plants that we don't necessarily want around if they're a little bit overpopulated, such as honeysuckle. It's a little counterintuitive, but it can be helpful to cut down a tree or two that we know coppices well, such as a black locust, because we know that at least the initial regrowth is quite fast, and that will act as a shrub until it's ready to, 8 or 9 years later, grow back up into a tree. So it has this lower vegetative structure that birds can hide themselves in, and nest in for that period of time, that interim period of time. And lastly, farm diversification and habitat regeneration. A lot of this that I've been talking about is not, it's about birds, but it's bigger than that. It's about long-term food system security for all of us. And even thinking about it from kind of this profit model, which is not the way that I tend to think about agriculture. Long-term health and longevity of the farm relies on diversification. If you're just growing one commodity crop or three commodity crops, and something happens, something destabilizes a market, and then suddenly you only have one that you can rely on, that leaves you in a really unsteady place. Whereas if you're growing 10 or 20 or 100 or 250 different plants, and or kind of tending to different species in that way, there's a lot more dynamism for things to come in and out of that system without having as much of a consequence for the farmer, right, for the steward. On top of that, of course, it regenerates habitat. I know I was kind of rushing through the last piece there. I want to leave time for questions, though. How are we doing on time?
This is perfect. We have like about 8 minutes for questions.
Wonderful.
It's
Well,
kind of perfect.
take it away.
So I just wanted to say, just a second, that you did a beautiful job of challenging our definitions that are, hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I just got, there we go. The way that we have used language to talk about, especially the concepts of sustainability, restoration, and regeneration, that was challenging and very nuanced. So I want to thank you for that. This has just been a very thoughtful and mindful presentation. So I learned a lot. So I appreciate that, Gabby. Okay. I think we had a hard question from Sinuan, which was a tough question for you. American work life is usually very busy. How would you advise individuals who want to become good ecological citizens while balancing busy work and personal lives, especially with people who are just beginning to get into the regenerative, ecological, naturalist, earth-friendly field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so much of, in particular, you bring up this idea of kind of the American work life, this efficiency that has come about because of the Green Revolution and because of our kind of market model for agriculture, hinges on the idea that we want things to be more efficient, right? We want things to be faster and easier, but all that's really allowed for thus far is the space for more work to happen. And I think, yes, I agree that it's a difficult entry point. Trying to find an entry point, it's really difficult to do. But I think that's a larger cultural question about slowing down. And I think within a land management perspective, there's this sense of urgency in regenerative agriculture that we need to do things differently starting yesterday, starting 10 years ago, starting 20 years ago. while that urgency is very understandable and very real, I think one of the most important things you can do is to just start by listening a lot to your land, and to people who have been doing land work for a long time, particularly folks who have been here the longest. Indigenous peoples have the most knowledge about this kind of agriculture. There's a lot to learn and a lot to be said for this kind of agriculture. So I think slowing down, listening, observing, keeping a journal, starting a phenological practice, an almanac is one of the most critical tools early on.
Great, thank you. We have a very specific question, which is, can you talk about the value of pokeweed for our bird friends?
Yes, sure. So pokeweed is a native plant. A lot of gardeners consider it to be, again, somewhat of a pest. Um, it is toxic in maturity to humans, though it is culturally used, at least by Appalachian folks, in poke salad, right? The young shoots. So for birds in particular, it's kind of this middling plant in terms of nutritional value, although because of its copiousness, its abundance, it is a nice replacement for things like honeysuckle that are particularly low in nutritional value. Um, so if you cut down honeysuckle and you don't have time to replace it immediately with something, you notice there's pokeweed coming up, don't bother chopping it down. Yeah, maybe it'll be a little bit of a job in the future, but it's a pretty easy thing to manage compared to the honeysuckle, and is definitely a step in the right direction for birds. So
Great, thanks. So from Eunice Brevik, thoughts on harnessing birds' poop power, partnering with their capacity to plant and farm. Specifically, are there structures that could be built on a property with natural or recycled materials that could serve as please poop here sites? Anything beyond basic fences or branches of trees? What a great question.
that's an amazing question. And one that I'd love to have a more complicated answer about, but I think one of the best things we can do is just observe the way that birds poop now, the places that they poop most abundantly, and mimic those structures as much as possible. And that just so happens to be by planting things for the most part. I mean, birds love to perch in mid-story to canopy for the most part, unless they're dealing with an aerial predator. So if you think of trees that grow quickly, particularly native trees, those are going to be your best friends in terms of creating that initial vector, that kind of number one, the oak tree type of thing. You know, the oak tree itself is a slow growing tree, but if you think of that as the starting point, right, metaphorically, particularly here in Ohio, and I believe in the eastern US, one of the fastest growing canopy trees is the tulip poplar. So I know a lot of folks start tulip poplars in early successional forest, and that could work really, really well as this initial vector. That also would really drastically minimize construction costs if you're thinking about creating structures for birds, though fence line is another like primo way to attract birds to poop in these very uniform agricultural lines for us.
Great. I think that is it for our questions. So I want to thank you so much, Gabby. This has been such a great and full hour.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been wonderful for me too. I've learned a lot by needing to make a presentation about all this.
Great. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and I want to invite you all back for one last session. And the session is with all of the conference planners. There are like 5 or 6 of us on the conference, and we're going to be sharing some of our takeaways, but we would love to have a conversation with you all to know what happened for you, what your takeaways were, how we could improve this conference. So please come back in 15 minutes for one last rich, we hope, hour. And I want to thank everybody for joining us on this. Really, it's a spectacular afternoon. I think it's almost 80 degrees. I saw an insect flying in your room, Gabby, and, for November 7th, what is 8th, that there's still bugs alive. It should not be. So, Yeah, let's write that down, the phenomenology of that particular event. So thank you so much, and see you back in 15 minutes. Whoops, just a second. We have a few more messages. Uh-oh. Great job, Gabby. Thank you. Love the opportunity to tap Gabby's vast knowledge and wisdom about birds and regenerative agriculture. Thanks, Gabby. Thank you. I'll be embracing poison ivy and pokeweed figuratively and from far away. I love hearing the wide view of your practices. Yeah, you have changed my attitude about a number of things, which are like, I usually call them evil. And you're like, oh, I can't believe you had this plant, so great. So, okay, so we will see you at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.